The cabin lights of Astralux Airlines shimmered in a soft gold as passengers filtered into the pristine interior of Flight AX118. But no one paid attention to the quiet woman already seated in 1A, head lowered, hands folded, wearing a simple navy blazer and carrying a laptop bag more worn than anything usually seen in first class. Her name was Dr. Mara Ellington, and to the few who truly knew her, she was a powerhouse, an aerospace engineer turned global strategist, a silent architect behind fleets of aircraft that carried millions each year. But to the uninformed, she looked like someone who didn't belong anywhere near the front of the plane. She knew it the moment the side-eyed glances began, the whispers slithering through the cabin like cold mist. Then came the first confrontation. A tall flight attendant with a tight smile, clipped tone, and an expensive shade of lipstick paused in front of her, scanning the seat map with exaggerated disbelief. "Ma'am," she said, voice steeped in polished condescension, "first-class boarding is later. You must have taken a wrong turn." Mara looked up calmly. "No," she replied. "My ticket is for 1A." The attendant blinked, stunned by the firmness beneath the quiet voice. But before she could respond, a passenger in 1B, a man in a designer suit with a jaw carved from arrogance, leaned over. "Maybe she's confused," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "These seats are assigned for our tier level." Laughter sparked, small at first, then spreading. Mara sat straighter, not speaking, not shrinking, because she had learned long ago that silence fuels fire, and power extinguishes it. The attendant pressed on. "May I see your boarding pass?" Her tone had sharpened, almost hostile. She handed it over without a word. The attendant's eyes darted to the screen, widening with something like panic, before she quickly masked it. "This must be a mistake," she said. "We'll sort it out." She walked off too quickly, and whispers exploded around Mara like embers in dry grass. "How'd she even pay for a first-class ticket?" someone murmured. "Probably upgraded by accident. She's in the wrong cabin, clearly." Every sentence hit like cold rain, but Mara remained still, a storm waiting for the right wind. She could reveal everything with a single sentence, one line, one truth. But she didn't, not yet. Not while their bias wrote its own script. Minutes later, two more attendants approached, whispering to one another as if handling a threat. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to step aside. We need to verify your identity with ground staff." Several phones lifted, recording. The man in 1B smirked with smug satisfaction, tapping his glass. "Told you," he said under his breath. Mara rose slowly, eyes locked forward, refusing to acknowledge the humiliation suffocating the air. She followed the attendants toward the front galley, where they whispered, argued, pointed at screens, scrolled, and frowned. The lead attendant returned with a stiff spine. "Your ticket appears valid," she admitted, "but we still need clarification. Your profile doesn't match a typical first-class traveler for this route." The statement wasn't even subtle. Mara exhaled through her nose, steadying her pulse. This happened too often. Different places, different people, same poison. She offered no argument. She simply replied, "I'll wait." And she did, while passengers stared like she was a spectacle rather than a person. 10 minutes passed, then 20, long enough for them to assume she'd be escorted out, long enough for their assumptions to tighten around her like rope. But Mara's expression remained unreadable, because she knew what they absolutely didn't. The plane, the airline, the employees, the stock value, every bolt, every contract belonged to her. And the moment she chose to reveal it would silence this entire cabin like a sudden power outage. The cabin's murmurs grew louder as Mara stood near the galley, awaiting her verification, while the attendants whispered with rising irritation, annoyed she hadn't snapped, argued, or bowed to the humiliation they fed her. Passengers watched like it was a show. The man in 1B had fully reclined, arms crossed with the smug confidence of someone who believed he had successfully protected the sanctity of his cabin. A woman a few rows back muttered, "I knew something was off the moment she boarded." Another added, "She doesn't look like first-class material." Their words were ugly but familiar, echoes of a world that always questioned who belonged where. Finally, a ground manager stepped aboard, short, flustered, and already irritated. "What's the issue?" she asked. The attendants spoke over each other, explaining how someone suspicious had boarded with a first-class ticket that didn't match her profile. The manager scanned Mara from head to toe in one slow, dismissive sweep. "Ma'am, I'm going to need your ID." Mara handed it over. The manager read the name, frowned, typed it in, waited, and suddenly froze. Not the kind of freeze caused by uncertainty, but by recognition. Her breathing hitched, her brows knit, her complexion paled as the screen blinked and an internal file unlocked. Ellington, Mara, J., Majority Owner, Astrolux Airlines, Executive Oversight Authority. The manager's jaw tightened with terror she tried desperately to hide. She swallowed. Twice, she glanced at the attendants who still stood there with crossed arms and impatient expressions, still convinced they were in the right. "Return her to her seat," she whispered urgently, "immediately." But it was too late. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we have an owner clearance alert for passenger 1A. Please advise." The entire cabin went silent. Dead, suffocating silence. Then the captain emerged from the cockpit fast enough to nearly rip the door off its hinges. His eyes darted to Mara, widening with the recognition only top-level executives ever met with. He removed his hat instantly, posture snapping straight like a soldier before royalty. "Dr. Ellington," he said, voice trembling with respect and fear. "Ma'am, we had no idea you were boarding today." The attendants' faces drained of color. The captain turned, fury warping his features as he faced them. "You detained the owner of the airline?" he said, voice low, lethal. The attendant stumbled over excuses. Wrong information, misunderstanding, thought she falsified documents, but the captain cut them off with a raised hand. "Save it." Then he turned to Mara. His tone softened. "Dr. Ellington, please allow me to personally escort you back to 1A. Mara didn't move. Her silence was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence before a verdict. Passengers gawked. Some whispered apologies. Others suddenly pretended they had defended her all along. The man in 1B sat upright so fast he nearly knocked over his drink. His face reddened with the realization that the woman who didn't look like she belonged was the reason he even had a plane to sit in. Mara finally spoke, her voice calm and crystalline. "I'd like to return to my seat, but I will address this before takeoff." And her words hung over the cabin like the toll of a bell. Mara walked back down the aisle, guided by the captain as if she were royalty, yet she kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the sudden reverence that replaced malice. She paused at 1A, placed her bag back under her seat, and sat with grace sharper than steel. The captain addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for your patience, but first we must acknowledge a serious misjudgment that took place." Every passenger stared, some shrinking under their own guilt. The attendants stood in the galley, trembling. "Dr. Mara Ellington," the captain continued, "is not only our executive oversight officer, she is the majority owner of Astrolux Airlines." Gasps erupted like firecrackers. The man in 1B covered his mouth with trembling fingers. The rude whispers died entirely. A couple who had laughed earlier now stared at their laps, unable to raise their eyes. Mara lifted her gaze and finally spoke to the entire plane. "Bias," she said quietly, "doesn't care about truth. and today it was allowed to dictate how I was treated. A hush blanketed the cabin. I boarded with a valid ticket. I sat in my assigned seat, but assumptions were made because of what I look like, and those assumptions escalated into humiliation. Her voice stayed steady, but emotion pulsed beneath every word. This airline was built to be a place where everyone is treated with dignity. That will not change on my watch. She stood. Before we take off, the individuals responsible for violating that standard will be relieved of duty. The attendants choked on their breath. The captain nodded to security waiting discreetly by the door. The attendants were removed, quietly, efficiently, faces streaked with fear and regret. The passengers remained frozen as Mara sat again, resting her hands gently over her bag. The man in 1B whispered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Mara replied without looking at him. "That's the problem, isn't it? People only behave when they know who someone is. Respect shouldn't require a title." And those words carved themselves into everyone's memory as the engines roared to life and the aircraft surged toward the sky. A sky Mara owned, but more importantly, a sky she intended to rebuild with justice stitched into every mile. If this story shook something in you, if even for a moment you felt the sting of injustice or the weight of assumptions, don't let that feeling fade when the screen goes dark. Stories like this expose what happens in silence, behind polite smiles and professional uniforms, where prejudice hides beneath procedure and bias disguises itself as protocol. But stories are also catalysts. They push conversations forward. They force reflection. They remind us that dignity is not optional, and equality isn't a privilege, it's a right. So if Mara's strength moved you, if her restraint, her composure, her power stirred something in your chest, take a second to speak up in the comments. Tell the world which moment hit you hardest. Share this video with someone who still judges by appearances. Let it challenge them. Let it wake them. And if you want more stories that confront injustice head-on, stories that refuse to be soft, that refuse to be silent, make sure you subscribe, because your voice, your engagement, your presence here keeps these stories alive. Share this video, like it, comment, amplify the message so it reaches someone who needs to hear it, because the world changes when enough people refuse to look away. Be one of those people. Be part of that change. This channel isn't just storytelling, it's a platform for truth, resilience, and the courage to face uncomfortable realities. And right now, by being here, you're part of that movement. Stay, speak, stand.